Saint-Denis, October 1793, north of Paris. Inside a church that had held the bones of French kings for more than 1,000 years. Men with crowbars went to work on the tombs. They had orders. The new republic wanted the old monarchy gone. And gone meant everything, all the way down to the dead. So they pried open the stone, one royal grave after another, and they hauled the kings out into the daylight. When they reached Henry IV, they stopped. His body had been embalmed so well that he barely looked dead. The beard was still there. The face was still recognizable. Accounts from that day say they stood him upright against a pillar and let people file past to look at the founder of the Bourbon line, the king who had once saved France from tearing itself apart. A soldier leaned in and cut a piece of his beard to keep as a souvenir. One woman, by later reports, stepped forward and slapped the dead king across the face. Then they were finished. They carried him out to the churchyard with all the others. Louis XIV, dozens more. The kings of France went into 2 open pits, and lime went in after them. Nobody called this war. It was something colder. A whole nation reaching back across the centuries to dig up its own rulers and make certain that nothing of them was left, which leaves a question hanging in the air above those pits. What does a country have to feel to hate even its dead this much? And underneath that one, a stranger question still. After all of it, did it even work? Because the blood they were trying to erase did not end in those pits. It left France, and more than 200 years later, it is still sitting on a throne. This is the story of how a family climbed so high that an entire nation tore open their graves to be rid of them, and how, even then, they would not disappear. Paris, 1594. The man who was legally the King of France sat outside the walls of his own capital and could not get in. By every law and every line of blood, the crown belonged to him. The throne was empty. The last king was dead. Henry of Navarre was next, and everyone knew it. There was only one problem, and it was the kind of problem no army and no lawyer could solve. Paris was a Catholic city. Henry was a Protestant, and the city had made up its mind that it would starve to death before it opened its gates to a heretic king. He had been here before, in one form or another. His whole life, for most of the 1500s, France had been tearing itself apart over religion. The Catholic majority and the Protestant minority, called Huguenots, were not arguing in lecture halls. They were burning each other's churches, massacring each other's towns, and turning the country into a patchwork of armed camps that trusted no one across the line of faith. France in those years was less a kingdom than a long, slow civil war with a crown sitting awkwardly on top of it. Henry was born on the Protestant side of that line, in a small kingdom called Navarre, tucked against the mountains in the south. He grew up outdoors, away from the perfumed world of the French court. He hunted. He slept rough. He learned to lead men who would follow him into a fight, not because protocol required it, but because they wanted to. By the time he was a young man, he was the most important Protestant noble in France, which made him valuable, and which also made him a target. Then came the night that taught him what kind of world he was actually living in. In August of 1572, Henry came to Paris for a wedding. His bride was Margaret of Valois, sister to the Catholic King of France, and the marriage was supposed to be a peace offering, a public signal that Catholic and Protestant France could share a country Huguenot nobles poured into the city to celebrate. They walked into a trap a few days after the ceremony. The killing started. It is remembered now as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and by most estimates it ran for days and claimed thousands of lives in Paris alone, with thousands more as the violence spread to other cities. Though the full count has never been settled, Catholic mobs hunted Protestants through the streets and pulled them from their homes. The Seine filled with bodies. Henry survived because he was royal, and because he gave the only answer that would keep him breathing. He agreed to convert to Catholicism. It was a conversion at the point of a knife, and everyone present understood it as exactly that. He spent the next several years as something between an honored guest and a prisoner at the French court, watched, managed, and waiting. When his chance came, he ran. He got out of Paris, rode south, renounced the forced conversion, and took his place again as the leader of the Huguenot cause. He had learned the thing that would shape everything he did afterward. Faith could be a sword pointed at your throat, and a crown meant nothing if you were dead. Years of war followed. France ground through rival claimants and rival armies until the line of Catholic kings simply ran out of men. In 1589, the reigning king was stabbed by a monk and died without an heir. On his deathbed, he named Henry of Navarre as his successor. A Protestant was now the legal king of France. Catholic France refused, and so Henry ended up where we found him, camped outside his own capital, a king with no city, fighting for a country that would not open its gates to him. He won battles. He was genuinely good at war, the kind of commander who ate what his men ate and rode where they could see him. He beat the Catholic armies in the field, but winning battles did not open Paris. And inside those walls people starved by the thousands rather than surrender to a heretic king. So Henry did the thing that defined him. He looked at a country that would never accept him as he was, and instead of forcing it, he changed himself to fit the country. In 1593, he converted to Catholicism again. This time, it was a cold, clear political decision, made with his eyes open. He knew exactly what it would cost him among the Protestants who had bled for him. There is a line history has attached to this moment, probably polished in the retelling, but true to the man. Parry, he is supposed to have said, is well worth a mass. The gates opened the following year. The city that had starved itself to keep him out welcomed him within hours, because exhausted people will forgive almost anything from a man who promises to stop the bleeding. Then he did something harder than winning a war. He governed like a man, trying to heal a country rather than punish one. In 1598, he signed the Edict of Nantes. It allowed Protestants to live, worship, and hold office in a Catholic kingdom. It was not full equality by any modern standard. It was something more practical than that. It was a king deciding that his people did not all have to believe the same thing in order to stop killing each other. After 4 decades of slaughter, that was close to a miracle. He rebuilt roads. He backed ministers who cleaned up the royal finances. He talked, in language ordinary people could understand, about wanting a France where every working family could put a chicken in the pot on Sunday. The nobles found him coarse. The country found him human. After everything France had been through, a king who wanted people fed was a king worth having. For about 12 years, it held. France breathed. Then, on a May afternoon in 1610, Henry climbed into his carriage to cross Paris. The streets in that part of the city were narrow, and on the Rue de la Ferronnerie the coach stopped, stuck behind a cart, blocking the way. It was an ordinary delay. A man named Francois Ravaillac had been following the king through the streets. He was a Catholic zealot who had convinced himself that Henry, the converted Protestant, was planning to make war on the Pope. While the carriage sat trapped in the traffic, Ravaillac stepped up onto the wheel, reached inside, and stabbed the king twice. The second blow went into his lung. Within minutes, Henry IV was dead in his own carriage, in the middle of his own capital. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The king who survived a massacre, who ended the religious wars, who built a law to let Catholics and Protestants share a country, was killed by a man who hated him for exactly that. The tolerance Henry created was the thing that got him killed. He left behind a son who was 8 years old, a kingdom finally at peace, and a name, Bourbon, that France had only just begun to know. He could not have known what that name would become. He could not have known that the family he started would build the most dazzling court Europe had ever seen. He could not have known that his own great-great-grandson would tear up the very law he signed to give Protestants peace, or that the kings who followed him would build a palace so magnificent it blinded them to their own country, and he certainly could not have known that 183 years after they laid him in the ground at St. Denis, his own countrymen would pry open his tomb, stand his body up against a pillar, and cut the beard from his face. Paris, 1624. The most powerful man in France wore red robes and had never sat on a throne. His name was Armand Jean Duplessis, and history remembers him by the title that made him famous, Cardinal Richelieu. He was thin, often sick, frequently in pain from the headaches and fevers that plagued him for most of his adult life. He worked through all of it, every day, at a desk covered in paper, because he had decided early on that his own comfort was simply not relevant to the job in front of him. The king had made him chief minister in 1624, and from that moment Richelieu had one fixed purpose. He wanted to make the King of France the only real power in France. That sounds obvious. It was not obvious then, and the distance between what it sounds like and what it actually required tells you everything about the man. France in the 1600s was not one country in the way we would understand the word. It was a collection of powerful nobles who held their own lands, kept their own soldiers, lived behind their own fortified walls, and obeyed the king only as much as they felt like obeying him on any given Tuesday. The great lords could raise armies. They could plot with foreign kings against their own crown. They could ignore royal commands and dare the monarchy to do something about it. The France that Henry IV had stitched back together was still, underneath, a kingdom where the king was the strongest noble rather than the master of all of them. Richelieu meant to that, and he had a gift for it that went beyond ambition. He could see further down the board than almost anyone alive. He started with the castles. All across France, the nobility held private fortresses, thick stone walls behind which a lord could defy the crown indefinitely. Richelieu ordered them demolished. Any fortification not needed to defend France's actual borders against foreign enemies had to come down. The message was plain, and it was delivered in rubble. A noble's home could be as grand as he liked. It could not be a place he hid in while he plotted against his king. Then came La Rochelle, and this is where you see what Richelieu was truly willing to do. La Rochelle was a Protestant port city on the Atlantic coast, wealthy, proud, and walled, with its own fleet and quiet support from Protestant England across the water. The Protestants of La Rochelle were not simply practicing their faith. They held a fortified city that answered, in moments of crisis, to something other than the crown, to Richelieu. who had nothing personal against Protestants as believers. That was intolerable. A state within a state, a power that the king did not control. In 1627, he laid siege to the city, and the way he did it reveals the man completely. He did not throw soldiers at the walls and hope. He thought bigger. He had his engineers construct a massive barrier across the mouth of La Rochelle's harbour, a sea wall stretching more than a mile into the water, sealing the city off from the ocean and from any English fleet that might come to relieve it. Then he sat down and waited for hunger to do the rest. The siege lasted 14 months. By the time La Rochelle surrendered in 1628, its population had been devastated. The city, reduced by starvation to a fraction of the people who had held it at the start, Richelieu let the survivors keep their religion. He took their walls, their weapons, and their independence. The lesson was the same one he taught the nobles. Believe what you want inside your own heart. In public, in politics, in the structure of this kingdom, there is one power, and it sits on the throne. Here is the detail about Richelieu that most people miss. The one that made his enemies call him a monster and made history call him a genius. He was a Catholic cardinal running a Catholic country during a great European war that was supposed to be Catholic against Protestant, and he spent French money supporting the Protestant side of that war, because the main Catholic power on the other side was the royal house that threatened France most, and weakening that rival mattered more to him than the faith they technically shared. His advisers found this shocking. His enemies called it hypocrisy. Richelieu called it the logic of the state, and he never lost a night of sleep over it. He had separated what was good for France from what was good for the Church, and when the two pointed in different directions, France won every time. The nobles tried to destroy him again and again. Even the king's own mother turned against him, convinced her son to dismiss him, and spent a single triumphant day certain she had won. It is remembered as the Day of the Dupes. That November morning in 1630, when half the court was sure Richelieu was finished, Louis XIII went away to think. When he came back, he kept the Cardinal and exiled his own mother instead. The king had looked at what he had with Richelieu and decided that no relationship in the world, including the one with the woman who raised him, was worth more than the man who was making his crown mean something. Richelieu died in 1642, worn through at 57, still at his desk. A priest who came to see him at the end asked whether he forgave his enemies. He is said to have answered that he had never had any enemies, except the enemies of France. Whether those were his exact words or a phrase that gathered around him afterward, it was the perfect last line for the man. He had spent his life making himself and the state the same thing, until he could no longer see where one ended and the other began. Louis XIII followed him into the grave a few months later. He left the throne to a son, 4 years old, and the machine Richelieu had built to a kingdom that was not yet ready to run it without a strong hand at the controls. The strong hand that came next was not a Frenchman either. It was another foreign churchman, another cardinal named Mazarin, who had learned at Richelieu's side and now stepped into his place beside the boy king and the mother ruling in his name. Mazarin was smoother than Richelieu, more charming, less cold. The nobles despised him even more, because on top of everything else, he was Italian, an outsider holding the power they believed was theirs by birthright, and so the machine that Richelieu built was about to be tested. The nobles who had been hammered down and humiliated for 20 years saw their chance. A child on the throne, a foreign minister, a mother who needed allies. They came for the crown with everything they had left, and in doing so, they created something they never intended. They created the man who would become the most powerful king in French history, by teaching him, as a small boy, exactly what fear felt like. Paris, a winter night, 1649. An 11-year-old boy lay in his bed in the royal palace and listened to the sound of a mob outside deciding whether to come in. He was Louis XIV, and the people making noise in the streets of Paris were not soldiers or assassins. They were ordinary citizens of his own capital, and that was almost the point. A rumor had spread that the royal family was planning to slip away in the dark, to leave Paris secretly and regroup somewhere safer. The crowd did not intend to allow it. They wanted to see their king. What happened next shaped everything that came after. The mob pushed into the palace and up the stairs and into the royal apartment. They demanded to see the boy. His attendant, thinking fast, told them the young king was asleep and led them quietly into the darkened bedroom to look. Louis lay in his bed, eyes closed, perfectly still, listening to the boots on the floor and the voices of strangers filling the room where he slept. He kept his eyes shut and did not move. He let them look. He gave them nothing. They left, satisfied. He never forgot a second of it. The reason that crowd was in his palace at all reaches back to his father's death and the years of instability that followed. When Louis XIII died in 1643, his heir was 4 years old. Real power passed to two people, his mother Anne, who served as regent, and Cardinal Mazarin, who governed beside her. Mazarin was brilliant and calculating, a worthy student of Richelieu, and he kept pushing the same direction his teacher had pointed, pulling more authority toward the crown and away from everyone else. The great nobles of France had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. 2 decades of Richelieu had stripped them of their fortresses and their independence, and they hated it. With a child on the throne and a foreign minister running the kingdom, they saw their moment. The high courts of Paris had their own grievances, about taxes, about who held real authority under the law. In 1648, everything broke open at once, into a series of revolts that lasted nearly 5 years, and that history calls the Fronde. The name came from a slingshot, the kind of crude weapon Paris street boys used to hurl stones at passing carriages for fun. The people who chose the name meant it as mockery, as if the government were a target for children. But the Fronde was no joke. It was a genuine collapse of order, with great lords raising private armies, the courts of Paris defying the crown openly, and the city itself turning against the boy king and the foreign minister who ruled in his name. For Louis, those years were not politics. They were something that lived in his body. The royal family fled Paris in the night, more than once, bundled into coaches in the dark and driven out of the capital before the violence could reach them. There were stretches when the future Sun King, the boy who would one day make European monarchs feel small by comparison, lived in genuine hardship, sleeping in beds with worn sheets, eating irregular meals, a prince of France surviving on the charity of whoever was willing to shelter the court that week. He watched the great nobles who bowed to his face plot against his crown the moment his back was turned. He watched the city of Paris, his own capital, become a place where the king was not safe. One particular night has come down through the accounts of people who were there. The royal family was woken before dawn and told they had to leave immediately. There was no time for the ceremony that normally surrounded every movement of the king. No procession, no preparation. They were put into a coach in the dark and driven out of the city like people running from a fire. Louis was 10 years old. He sat in that coach and watched Paris disappear behind him. And he understood, in the wordless way that children understand things that adults cannot explain, that the city was something to escape from. He would spend the rest of his life proving it. Mazarin outmaneuvered the rebels eventually. The nobles were too divided and too suspicious of each other to hold together. And by 1653, the Fronde had burned itself out. The monarchy survived. On the surface, it looked as if the crisis had passed, and the young king had simply lived through a difficult stretch of his childhood before growing into his throne. Underneath, something had hardened into place that would never move again. Louis had watched what happened when power was shared. When nobles and courts and cities each held a piece of authority, he had slept in patched sheets and hidden in a coach in the dark and pretended to be asleep while strangers filed through his bedroom. He had learned, in the part of a person that forms young and stays forever, two things that would define his entire reign. The nobles could never be trusted. Give them any independent power, and they would use it against the crown the first chance they got. And Paris itself was the enemy. The crowded, rumor-fed, unpredictable city had humiliated him, hunted him, and sent strangers to stand over his bed to make sure he had not run. He would never feel safe inside its walls again. Mazarin kept governing through the 1650s. And Louis, growing into a watchful and serious young man, stayed close and studied. He learned how power actually worked, who held it, how it moved from hand to hand. He had the patience of a man who had spent years waiting for his moment, because that is exactly what he was. In March of 1661, Mazarin died. The Council of Ministers gathered the next morning, waiting to be told who the new chief minister would be. Louis walked into the room and gave them their answer. There would be no chief minister. He would govern France himself, directly. Starting that morning, they were to bring every decision to him and to no one else. The room did not quite believe it. For his entire life, other men had run France in his name. His mother, Mazarin, the long parade of advisers and regents who had treated the king as a symbol to manage rather than a man to obey. But the boy who had lain still in the dark while strangers searched his bedroom had grown up with one thought burning at the center of him. Never again would he let other men hold the power that belonged to the crown. He was going to take every thread of authority in France and pull it into his own hands. And he was going to build himself a place to do it from, far from Paris, where no mob would ever stand over his bed again. The sun was about to rise, and the place he chose to rise from would become the most famous address in the world. Vaux le Vicomte, August, 1661. The most powerful man in France threw a party so perfect that it ended his life. His name was Nicolas Fouquet, and he ran the royal treasury. Over the years, through methods that blurred the line between clever and corrupt, he had grown very rich, and he had spent a great deal of that money on a country estate called Vaux le Vicomte. He had hired the best architect in France, the best painter, the best garden designer, and he had pointed them all at the same piece of countryside and told them to build something that had never existed before. They delivered. The gardens ran in perfect symmetry toward the horizon. The fountains caught the late afternoon light. The painted ceilings made the rooms feel like the inside of a dream. Nothing in France came close to it. In August of 1661, Fouquet invited the young king to come see what his minister had built. and he pulled out every stop to make the evening unforgettable. A feast on solid gold plates. A new play by Molière, performed in the gardens with candles strung through the trees. Fireworks that lit up the sky over the fountains. Thousands of guests. The full spectacle of a man, at the height of his wealth and confidence, showing the King of France what was possible when you really spent the money. Louis XIV, 22 years old, and only months into ruling for himself, walked through that house and felt something go cold inside him. A servant, a man who worked for the crown, had built something more magnificent than anything the king owned. That fact sat in Louis's chest like a stone. He had grown up in patched sheets during the Fronde, watching powerful men treat the crown as a thing to manage and maneuver around. He had just declared that he would rule France himself, alone, without a chief minister. And here was his own treasurer, living like a god in the countryside, while the king who paid his salary watched. In Louis's mind, wealth like this did not come from honest service. It came from someone helping himself to what belonged to the crown. He did not say a word that evening. He smiled. He thanked his host. He left. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested. He was charged with embezzlement, tried, and convicted. He spent the rest of his life in a fortress prison, dying there decades later. The most spectacular host in French history, brought down by a single evening that had gone too well. Now here is the part that tells you who Louis XIV actually was. The day after the arrest, the king sent word to Vaux le Vicomte. He wanted the architect, the painter, the garden designer, every artist and craftsman who had built that estate, brought to work for him. Whatever a mere treasurer could commission, the king would do 100 times larger. He had seen what they could do. Now he intended to use them. He had found his team. Now he needed his canvas. This is who France would spend the next 50 years living under. Not a man who was satisfied by power in the abstract, but a man who understood that power had to be seen to be real. That the king who impressed no one was a king who would, eventually, be defied. Louis had a gift for performance that went beyond vanity. It was political strategy, dressed as spectacle. He chose the sun as his symbol. And the choice was not humble. The sun is what everything else orbits, the source of all light, the thing that makes life possible on earth. Louis meant France to understand him exactly that way. He even performed the part in person. As a young man, he danced in court ballets, and in one famous production, he appeared in full golden costume as the rising sun itself, blazing at the center of the stage while the court watched. The name caught on, the Sun King, and he spent the rest of his life making sure that everything in France, every noble, every minister, every institution, revolved around him. The king's body became a kind of public religion. Every morning, waking up was a ceremony called the Lever, the Rising, attended by dozens of the highest nobles in France, each one competing for the specific honor of handing the king his shirt or holding the basin while he washed. When Louis walked through his palace, courtiers stepped back and bowed. When he ate, people watched. When he went to bed, at night, the same ceremony ran in reverse. The most powerful men in the kingdom organized their days around the simple acts of one man's body. Because Louis had made proximity to the king the only currency at court that actually mattered, it looks strange from the outside. Grown men fighting over the right to hold a candlestick. But Louis understood something about human nature that turned this strangeness into genius. Every noble consumed with the etiquette of the royal bedroom was a noble who was not back home, raising an army. Every lord drowning in the social competition of the court was a lord who had no time or energy left for the kind of independent ambition that had made the Fronde possible. He had taken the most dangerous class in France and given them a golden game to play. And they had walked right into it, to build the machinery that made all of this sustainable. Louis leaned on a minister named Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a man of Richelieu's school, tireless and cold, who rebuilt the royal finances and the French economy with the same focused efficiency that Richelieu had brought to dismantling noble power. Colbert overhauled the tax system, expanded French industry, and built up the navy until France had the strongest military in Europe and a treasury capable of funding the ambitions of the most extravagant king on the continent. The army grew. French became the language of every royal court, from Madrid to Moscow. When Louis spoke, the other kings of Europe listened, because France was now powerful enough to make them, and underneath all of it, behind the gold and the ceremony and the dancing, was the boy from the Fronde who had decided he would never again be at anyone's mercy. Total control. One center, one sun. There was only one thing left, a stage worthy of the performance, a place far enough from Paris that no crowd would ever push through his bedroom door again, grand enough to pull the whole French nobility into the king's own house, where he could watch them, manage them, and keep them permanently occupied. He already knew where to build it. 12 miles from Paris, in a stretch of marshy countryside where his father had once kept a small hunting lodge, in a place called Versailles. Versailles, the 6th of May, 1682. On that date, the King of France made it official. The court, the government, the entire apparatus of the most powerful kingdom in Europe would now operate from a palace in the countryside, 12 miles from Paris. Surrounded by gardens that went on further than the eye could follow, the construction had been going on for years. And in many wings, it was still going on. Workmen were everywhere. The smell of wet plaster drifted through half-finished corridors. None of that stopped Louis. The palace was ready enough to do the job it had been designed to do. And the job was not what most people assumed when they looked at it. From the outside, Versailles looks like a monument to one man's vanity. The largest palace in the world, built to celebrate a king who already had everything. And, yes, that was part of it. But that reading misses the architecture underneath the architecture. Versailles was a machine, and like all of Richelieu's and Louis's best ideas, it solved a problem that had looked unsolvable. The problem was the nobility, the great lords of France, the men whose ancestors had hunted Louis through his own capital during the Fronde, were still out there, still on their estates, still theoretically capable of raising armies and making trouble. Louis could not kill them all. He could not strip them of their titles and their lands without tearing apart the social fabric that held the kingdom together. What he could do was make Versailles the only place in France that mattered, and then make sure they had no choice but to come there and stay. So he built the trap and made it beautiful. If you were a noble who wanted anything from the crown, a military commission, a pension, a favorable word on a lawsuit, a good marriage for your daughter, you had to be at Versailles to get it. Power, money, and opportunity all flowed from one man, and that man lived 12 miles from Paris, surrounded by his court. The nobles came. They left their estates and their local power bases and moved into the king's house, because the alternative was irrelevance. Once they arrived, Louis held them with something more durable than force. Life at Versailles ran on an elaborate system of rules about who could stand where, who could sit in whose presence, who had the right to enter which room, who held which object during which ceremony. These rules were not decoration. They were the whole mechanism. Royal favor was a currency, and the etiquette was how you earned it or lost it, day by day, hour by hour. The noble, who was allowed to hand the king his shirt in the morning, had won something over the noble who only got to watch. A man could spend his entire life chasing those tiny distinctions. And many men did. And that was exactly the point. A duke consumed with court ceremony was a duke who was not home building an army. The system worked so well that it bankrupted the people it was designed to contain. Keeping up appearances at Versailles cost a fortune. The right clothes, the right gambling tables, the right entertainments, the right appearances at the right moments. The great nobles of France spent themselves into debt trying to compete for royal attention, and a nobleman drowning in debt had no money left to raise soldiers, and a soldierless nobleman was no threat to anyone. Louis had defanged the most dangerous class in France by convincing them that the cage was paradise. At the heart of it all, he built the room that said everything. The Hall of Mirrors was finished in the 1680s, and nothing like it existed anywhere in the world. It was a gallery stretching more than 200 feet, lined on one side with 17 tall windows looking out over the gardens. On the opposite wall, matching those windows, arch for arch, Louis placed mirrors, hundreds of them, the finest in Europe, throwing the daylight back across the hall and filling the whole length of it with a brilliance that had to be seen to be believed. In the 1600s, a single quality mirror was a luxury object. The craft of making them was a closely guarded Venetian secret, and a piece large enough to dress in front of was something wealthy families saved for. Louis covered an entire wall of his palace with them, and the effect was overwhelming in a way that was not accidental. Foreign ambassadors were walked the full length of that gallery on their way to meet the king, past their own reflections, multiplied and doubled in the light, so that by the time they reached Louis at the far end, they understood, in their bodies and not just their minds, exactly what they were dealing with. But stand in that room and think about what it actually is. The king surrounded on every side by light, by gold, by beauty, and by his own reflection, returned to him from every angle. Everywhere Louis looked in the most magnificent room in his palace, he saw himself. The room was built to send the king's image back to the king, magnified, gilded, made permanent. Louis had built a world that reflected only itself, for now, in the early years at Versailles, that world was working exactly as designed. The nobility danced in the galleries and gossiped in the gardens and competed for the king's attention with the desperate energy of people who had been given nothing else to want. The court dazzled every ambassador and traveller who passed through it. The king was as secure as a king could be, watched over by no one, challenged by no one, surrounded by people whose every waking thought was organized around pleasing him. The trap was perfect. The cage was golden. The only thing the mirrors could not show Louis was what lay outside the windows. 12 miles away, Paris went on living its own life. Further out, in the provinces and the farms and the cities that the court never visited, France went on paying for all of this with money and labor and lives, generation after generation, in a bargain that only one side had agreed to. For now, that France was quiet. It would not stay quiet, but the noise it would eventually make was still a long way off. and inside the Hall of Mirrors, with the light bouncing back from every surface. It was impossible to hear anything except the sound of Versailles reflecting itself. Fontainebleau, October, 1685. On a quiet morning, in a palace southeast of Paris, Louis XIV picked up a pen and erased the greatest thing his grandfather had ever done. The document in front of him was the Edict of Fontainebleau. What it did, in the careful language of royal decree, was cancel the Edict of Nantes, the law Henry IV had signed nearly 90 years before to let Protestants live in peace in a Catholic France. Henry had paid for that law with his reputation among Catholics, his relationships with foreign powers, and ultimately, in the view of the man who killed him, his life. The edict was the thing Henry had been most proud of. It was the proof that a king could stop a religious war by deciding that his people did not all have to believe the same thing. His great-grandson tore it up because it spoiled the reflection. Louis had come to believe that a truly great king ruled one people under one law and one faith. The Protestants were a flaw in that vision, a group of his subjects who worshipped differently and therefore, in his mind, belonged to something other than the unified France he saw when he looked in the mirror at Versailles. He had convinced himself that the Huguenots were nearly converted anyway, that a firm push would finish what gentler measures had started, and that a France of one faith would be stronger and more glorious than the imperfect France Henry had settled for. He was wrong. In almost every way it is possible to be wrong about something. Even before the edict was signed, soldiers had been quartered in Protestant homes across France. Rough men deliberately billeted on Huguenot families with the understanding that they could make life miserable in whatever ways they found useful, until the household agreed to convert. They smashed furniture. They stole food. They terrorized children. Whole towns converted on paper to make the soldiers go away, signing whatever documents the church put in front of them and going home to believe exactly what they had always believed. Then, in October of 1685, came the decree itself. Protestant churches were to be demolished. Protestant ministers were expelled from the country. Protestant schools were closed. The religion that Henry IV had fought a civil war to protect no longer legally existed in France. What followed was one of the most expensive mistakes in French history, and Louis never fully understood the cost. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled the country. Getting out was illegal. The borders were watched, and being caught meant prison or the galleys. But they left anyway, family by family, in the dark, through mountain passes and across rivers, carrying what they could and leaving everything else behind. And here is the part that stung most. The Huguenots were not, on the whole, peasants. They were among the most productive people in France. Weavers, clockmakers, merchants, bankers, skilled craftsmen of every description. People who made things and traded things and built things. They took their skills and their knowledge and their money out of France and gave all of it to France's rivals. Protestant England took them in and grew richer. The Dutch Republic took them in and grew richer. The Protestant states of Germany took them in and grew richer. France bled out its own talent to make the king's reflection a little more perfect. And the countries that received what France threw away used it to build the very strength they would turn against Louis in the wars to come. And the wars came. They always came. Louis loved what war could buy, which was territory and fear and the respect that powerful nations show only to nations more powerful than themselves. The early wars went well. France expanded. Louis collected pieces of Europe the way other men collected debts. And for a while, the continent simply absorbed it because no one was strong enough to stop him alone. But the rest of Europe was watching, and what they saw terrified them. And terrified nations eventually stop being terrified and start being dangerous. They built coalitions against him, great alliances of countries that had nothing in common except their fear of France. And the later wars were grinding, ruinous, and long. France was now fighting half of Europe at once, year after year, and the cost was crushing in every direction. Every soldier, every cannon, every supply wagon had to be paid for, and the money came from the one part of France that had no power to refuse. The peasants, the farmers, the labourers, the ordinary working people of a country where the nobles and the church paid little and the poor paid everything. Then came the winter that made all the other costs look manageable by comparison. The winter of 1709 was one of the coldest in European memory. It arrived in January and it stayed, and it reached down into the ground and killed what was there. Rivers froze solid from bank to bank. Fruit trees that had stood for generations split open in the cold. The seed grain that farmers had saved for spring planting froze in the barns. When the thaw came, there was almost nothing left to plant. And what little came up in the damaged soil was not enough. France starved. Hundreds of thousands of people died that year, in villages and in cities, in the cold or from the hunger that followed it. Ordinary people who had paid for Louis's wars and Louis's palace and Louis's vision of a unified Catholic France, and received in return a winter they could not survive. Out at Versailles, the court continued. The rituals went on. The king rose every morning to his attendance, walked his gardens, ate his meals in public. Louis himself was not indifferent to the disaster. He sent some of his own gold dishes to be melted down for relief. He received the reports, and he grieved. In whatever way a man can grieve for a catastrophe, his own choices helped create. But the palace went on, and the gap it represented went on with it. In one France, people ate bark and died in frozen ditches by the hundreds of thousands. In the other France, 12 miles from Paris, the most expensive court in the world kept the chandeliers burning. Death came for the family too. In the last years of Louis's reign, a chain of losses moved through the royal bloodline with a thoroughness that felt almost deliberate. The heir to the throne, the king's own son, caught smallpox and died. The grandson, who was next in line, died within a year, along with his wife. The great-grandson after them died as a small child. 4 generations of heirs, gone in a handful of years, until the direct succession of the most powerful monarchy in Europe rested on a single 5-year-old boy. Louis XIV died in 1715, 77 years old, having reigned for 72 of them, the longest reign of any major European monarch in history. He died of gangrene in his leg, in his great bedroom at Versailles, while the court waited in the rooms outside. His last recorded words to the small child who would follow him have come down through accounts of those present at his bedside, and they carry the weight of a man reviewing a very long bill. He told the boy not to copy him in his love of building and his love of war. He said he had spent too much and fought too much. He asked the child to seek peace with his neighbours and to remember that all the glory of this world was nothing. It was a strange and honest confession from the man who had made himself the sun. A quiet admission from the most magnificent king in Europe, that the magnificence had cost more than it was worth. He had built Versailles. He had made France feared across the continent. He had also driven out hundreds of thousands of his most productive citizens, exhausted his treasury on wars that gained less and less, taxed his poorest subjects to death while his richest paid almost nothing, and built a system so locked around his own person that when he died, the machine did not know how to run without him. France was left with the bill, and the child who inherited it was 5 years old. Madrid, November, 1700. In a dark palace in the Spanish capital, a dying king with no children was about to give away the largest empire on earth. His name was Charles II, and he was the last of his line, the final product of a royal house that had been marrying within itself for so many generations that the bloodline had quietly collapsed. He had been sick his entire life. He had no heir, and, for years, while he clung to existence in his gloomy Madrid palace, every royal court in Europe had been running calculations about what would happen when he finally let go. The Spanish crown was not just Spain, it was the Americas, Italy, territories scattered across the world, the silver of the New World still flowing back across the ocean, in quantities that made other kings dizzy to think about. Whoever inherited Spain would instantly become one of the most powerful rulers on earth. Every great house in Europe wanted it. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs had a claim, based on generations of intermarriage. The French Bourbons had a claim too, through Louis XIV's Spanish wife. Both sides had been maneuvering for years, and both sides understood that whoever got Spain could not be allowed to also keep everything else they already held, or the balance of European power would shatter completely. As Charles lay dying, the pressure on him was suffocating. He had to choose, and the choice would reshape the continent. In the end, he made a decision that surprised almost everyone. He left everything, the entire Spanish Empire, in all its staggering scope, to a French prince, to Philip, Duke of Anjou, the 17-year-old grandson of Louis XIV. The logic, in the end, was simple. A Bourbon with the full weight of France behind him could protect what a Habsburg too focused elsewhere might lose. Charles wanted his empire to survive intact after his death, and he bet that a strong French connection gave it the best chance. So the grandson of the man Spain had spent a generation fearing became the heir to everything Spain possessed. When the news reached Versailles, Louis understood what he was holding. His family would now sit on two of the greatest thrones in Europe simultaneously. Grandfather in France, grandson in Spain, the same blood on both sides of the mountains that had always separated the two kingdoms. There is a line attached to this moment in the historical record, spoken either by Louis himself or by one of his courtiers, that captures the scale of what had just happened. The Pyrenees, someone said, no longer exist. The rest of Europe heard those words and felt something close to panic. A combined Bourbon, France, and Spain would be a block of power that no single country and no realistic coalition could match. It would mean Bourbon dominance over the trade routes of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Americas. It would mean the end of the balance that kept any one kingdom from swallowing all the others. Britain and Austria and the Dutch Republic and most of the German states looked at the situation and arrived at the same conclusion. They were going to war. The War of the Spanish Succession ran for more than a decade. It was the war that broke what remained of Louis XIV's treasury. The war that dragged on through the famine, winter of 1709. The war that bled France white at the moment it could least afford it. The irony was almost cruel. The inheritance that was supposed to crown Louis's life's work became the millstone that pulled his final years under. The peace that ended the fighting in 1713 drew a line that would define the Bourbon family forever. Philip was allowed to keep Spain and its empire. He would be Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain. But Europe held one condition that it would not negotiate away. The crowns of France and Spain could never, under any circumstances, be united on a single head. Philip had to renounce his claim to France for himself and every one of his descendants. There would be a Bourbon in Paris and a Bourbon in Madrid, but never the same Bourbon wearing both crowns. So, the family split into two permanent branches. The senior line in France, ruling from Versailles, carrying the main weight of the Bourbon name. The junior line in Spain, ruling from Madrid, descended from Louis's grandson Philip, barred forever from the French throne. At the time, the division felt like a consolation. France was the heart of the dynasty, the senior line, the seat of all that Bourbon power and magnificence. Spain was the branch sent away, the secondary claim, the offshoot that would have to make do with a different palace in a different country. Nobody watching in 1713 would have looked at that junior Spanish line and seen the future of the family. But keep it in mind, because everything you are about to watch happened to the French Bourbons. The slow rotting of the system from the inside, the revolution, the guillotine, the graves torn open and the bones dissolved in lime. All of it falls on the senior line in Versailles. The glory is theirs, the catastrophe is theirs, and when it is over, when the senior line has been hunted to the edge of extinction and driven from French soil, it will be the junior branch, the one sent over the mountains and half forgotten, that carries the blood forward. The Bourbons had just planted the seed that would let them outlast their own destruction. They did not know it. They were too busy fighting a war. Versailles, the spring of 1711. In the space of 12 months, death walked through the royal family of France and took almost everyone standing between the throne and a child not yet born. It started with the Grand Dauphin, the king's only legitimate son, a man in his 50s who had spent his entire adult life waiting to be king. He caught smallpox in April of 1711 and was dead within days. It was a hard loss, but the succession still looked safe. The crown would pass to the grandson instead, a thoughtful young man who many at court believed would make a fine ruler. Behind him stood his wife, and behind them stood their sons, little boys in the nurseries, 4 generations deep. No dynasty in Europe had a more secure line. Then February of 1712 arrived, and the line collapsed like a building with no foundation. A fever swept through the royal apartments. Nobody could name it with certainty or stop it with anything the physicians of the day knew how to do. It took the grandson, the new heir, within days. Before the family had finished grieving, it took his wife. Within the week, it reached into the nursery and killed their older son, the boy who would have been king after them. 3 heirs in less than a month. The most protected family in France, surrounded by the best doctors money could reach, watched the succession disappear in a matter of weeks. 1 child survived, a 2-year-old boy, the younger grandson, lying sick in the same nursery that had just taken his brother. The physicians were ready to bleed him, the standard treatment of the era, the same treatment that had preceded the deaths of everyone else. His governess, a woman named the Duchess of Ventadour, refused. She locked the door of the nursery and would not let the doctors near him with their instruments. She kept the child warm, kept him fed, and waited. Whether she saved his life or simply declined to finish what the fever had started is something no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that the boy lived. 3 years later, in 1715, Louis XIV died, and the crown travelled across all those empty spaces in the family tree and settled on the head of a 5-year-old child. The new king, Louis XV, had survived when everyone around him died. France knew the story. The country had followed the losses with the horrified attention of people watching a disaster they cannot stop. And when the little boy emerged alive from that nursery, something in the public imagination attached itself to him. He was the child who made it through, the miracle that the dynasty had needed. When he was old enough to appear in public, crowds turned out to see him with the warmth people reserve for things they are grateful simply exist. He was also, from the start, genuinely beautiful. As he grew, Louis XV became one of the most physically striking young men at a court that had never lacked for handsome faces. He was graceful, elegant, and carried himself with an ease that the courtiers around him spent years trying to imitate. France looked at this young king and felt, after the long grey exhaustion of the Sun King's final decade, something close to relief. The country had been through the wars and the famine and the funerals, and here, at last, was something worth looking at. They called him Louis the Beloved, and they meant it. Here is the thing about that name. It was not flattery from the court, not the automatic praise that surrounded every king regardless of merit. It came from the people, from ordinary French men and women who had decided, before Louis had done anything in particular to earn it, that they loved him. When he fell dangerously ill in 1744, barely into his 30s, the country reacted with a grief so public and so genuine that foreign observers sent letters home trying to describe it. People gathered outside churches to pray. Masses were said across France for his recovery. When he survived, the celebrations ran for days. The country had handed this man its heart without conditions. That kind of trust, given so freely and so early, is either the greatest gift a king can receive or the most dangerous. Everything depends on what he does with it. Louis XV spent the next 30 years spending it and getting almost nothing back for the country that gave it. He was intelligent, which made it worse. He was not a stupid man who failed to see the problems around him. He saw them clearly. The finances were a slow disaster, building toward a fast collapse. The tax system that crushed the poor and protected the rich was obviously unsustainable. The gap between the court and the country was wide enough to be visible from Versailles on a clear day. If anyone at Versailles had cared to look, Louis saw all of it and could not make himself do the hard, unglamorous, ferociously unpopular work of fixing any of it. Reform meant fighting the nobles. It meant fighting the church. It meant making enemies of the most powerful people in the kingdom, the people he saw every day, the people whose cooperation made his daily life comfortable. And Louis, for all his intelligence, chose comfort over the fight, year after year, until the years became decades and the problems became catastrophes. He had one gift he used without restraint, and it was the gift for pleasure. The court under Louis XV became something different from the court his great-grandfather had built. Louis XIV's Versailles was about control, about performance, about the systematic management of power dressed up as ceremony. Louis XV's Versailles was about enjoyment. The distinction sounds small. It was not. A court organized around control can survive a weak king because the system holds things together. A court organized around pleasure is only as durable as the pleasures last, and the pleasures lasted a very long time. Long enough to make everyone forget that they would eventually run out. Versailles. The 1750s. Her name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, and she had been born a commoner in Paris, the daughter of a financial speculator, and she had risen through intelligence and beauty and an exceptional ability to make herself interesting to exactly the right people, all the way to the side of the King of France. The court called her Madame de Pompadour, the title Louis had given her, and they both adored and resented her for the same reason. She was better at her position than most of them were at theirs. She had genuine taste, real intelligence, and an instinct for culture that made her one of the great patrons of the French arts. Under her influence, the court became a place of exquisite paintings, perfect furniture, and refined entertainment. Voltaire dedicated works to her. Architects built for her. She shaped an entire style of French elegance that the rest of Europe would spend decades trying to copy. She also kept the king occupied, and that was perhaps her most consequential function. Louis XV needed to be occupied. Without structure, without someone managing his attention, he grew bored. And a bored Louis was a Louis who retreated from the work of governing entirely. Pompadour gave him beauty, diversion, conversation, and the comfortable feeling that Versailles was the most sophisticated place in the world. She was very good at it, and while she managed the king's pleasures inside the palace, the country outside the palace changed in ways that neither of them was tracking closely enough. The pamphlets appeared first. Paris had a culture of underground printing, of sheets and booklets and satirical verses that circulated through the coffee houses and markets, passing from hand to hand with the speed of rumor. In the 1750s, those pamphlets began to turn on the court with a sharpness that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The king was mocked. His mistresses were described in terms that courtiers found shocking and Parisians found entertaining. Marie Anne de Mailly, an earlier royal favourite, had been jeered through the streets of Paris when she fell from favour. Pompadour was depicted in print as a commoner manipulating a weak king, a woman with no royal blood pulling France by the nose. The street humour about the court grew coarser and more confident every year. Something had shifted. And the shift was this. The people of France had stopped being afraid of what they said about the king. Louis XV was aware of it. He received reports. He knew what was being printed and sold in Paris. He even, by some accounts, collected the pamphlets mocking him, reading them in private with a expression people described as difficult to name. Somewhere between amusement and despair. He did not stop the presses. He did not have the people responsible punished with the thoroughness his great-grandfather would have brought to the same situation. He shrugged and moved on to the next entertainment. And the presses kept running. Then France lost a war, and the mockery found harder material. The 7 Years' War, which France fought from 1756 to 1763, was supposed to restore French power and prestige after years of declining influence. Instead, it was a disaster of the first order. France lost its vast territories in North America, the great stretch of land along the Mississippi and the steep Lawrence that French explorers had claimed over generations. Handed over to Britain in the peace settlement, France lost significant influence in India. The French navy, already weaker than the British, was beaten repeatedly and never fully recovered. The kingdom that had been the greatest power in Europe under the Sun King watched its global position shrink to something that looked, from the outside, uncomfortably like retreat. The country that had once made the rest of Europe fear, it was now losing colonies to the British, while the king read pamphlets, making fun of his mistresses. The beloved was becoming something else. By the time Louis XV was in his 60s, the affection the country had given him so freely was almost entirely gone. The man who had been prayed over in churches across France during his illness, whose survival had caused celebrations that lasted for days, was now a subject of open contempt. He had outlasted his welcome by decades. He had taken the enormous goodwill of a country that wanted to love him and spent it, piece by piece, on comfort and avoidance and the pleasures of a court that had stopped looking out its own windows. In May of 1774, he caught smallpox, the disease that had cleared his own path to the throne 60 years before. It moved through him quickly and badly, and the illness was so contagious and so disfiguring that the normal ceremonies of a royal death were impossible. The man who had ruled France for 59 years died in a sick room that people were afraid to enter. What happened to his body afterward is the clearest measure of how completely the love had drained away. There was no grand funeral procession. The body was too dangerous to display. They sealed the coffin, loaded it onto a cart at night, and moved it quickly and quietly away from Versailles toward Saint-Denis, in the dark, with no ceremony, like something that needed to be disposed of rather than mourned. And along the road, as the hurried convoy passed, people came out of their houses in the night and lined the route, not to grieve, but to mock. They shouted insults at the passing coffin. There are accounts of people making obscene gestures as the cart went by, jeering the dead king as his body was carried away in the dark toward the royal tombs. The beloved went to his grave at night, hated, while people laughed at his coffin in the dark. He left the throne to his grandson, a shy young man of 19 who had not been expecting the crown this soon and had not been fully prepared for what it meant to hold it. When the old king died, the young heir and his wife knelt together and prayed out loud. Their words were recorded by someone in the room who understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something. God guide us and protect us. They said, "We are too young to reign." Outside the palace, the country that had just buried Louis XV in the dark, while people jeered, was waiting. It had been patient. It had been disappointed too many times, by too many kings who saw the problems clearly and chose comfort instead. Its patience was not finished. Not quite yet. But it was close. And the young man kneeling in that room was inheriting not just a crown, but everything the crown had allowed to go wrong for 60 years. All the debt and all the distance and all the accumulated weight of a system that had spent a century looking in the mirror and forgetting to look out the window. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did the girl kneeling beside him, the Austrian princess who would soon become the most hated woman in France. Versailles, the spring of 1778. Into the most elaborate court in Europe walked an old American in a plain brown coat and a fur cap, and the whole place lost its mind over him. His name was Benjamin Franklin, and he had come to France with one job. He needed the most powerful monarchy in the world to help a group of colonial rebels overthrow a king. And he understood something about Versailles that made him extraordinarily good at asking. He understood that this was a court that had seen everything, that was bored by everything, that had been performing the same rituals of elegance and sophistication for 100 years, and had run out of ways to surprise itself. So he gave them something they genuinely had never encountered. He played the part of the simple, honest man from the wilderness. He wore plain clothes on purpose. In a palace where every man spent a fortune on silk and powder, he let his hair go natural, while wigs towered over every head in the room. He spoke with the directness of someone who had never learned to wrap a thought in layers of courtly indirection. And the French, who had spent their entire lives wrapping everything in exactly that, found it intoxicating. His face appeared on medallions, on snuff boxes, on decorative prints sold across Paris. The most fashionable court on earth made a celebrity out of a man who was performing the opposite of fashion, and neither side was entirely fooled by the performance, but both sides enjoyed it enormously. Franklin was not there to be charming. He was there to pull France into a war, and the young King of France was about to make a decision that would help win American independence and help destroy his own throne in the same motion. To understand why France would even consider it, you have to go back to the hatred. France and Britain had been enemies for centuries, and in living memory the enmity had gotten much worse. Just a decade and a half before Franklin arrived, France and Britain had fought the 7 Years' War, and France had lost catastrophically. Colonies gone, naval power diminished, global influence shrunk. Britain had humiliated France in front of the world and emerged as the dominant power in both hemispheres, while France sat with the bill and the memory of what it felt like to be beaten that badly. The American Rebellion was the opportunity France had been waiting for. Britain's own colonies, the jewel of the empire that had beaten France, were in open revolt against the crown. If France backed the rebels and the rebels won, Britain would lose the most valuable piece of what it owned. The enemy that had humiliated France would itself be humiliated. The logic was almost impossible to argue with. The problem, and it was an enormous one, was that France could not afford another war. The treasury was already stretched from decades of the Sun King's spending, from Louis XV's wars, from the endless cost of Versailles. France was running a deficit that its finance ministers described in language that grew more alarmed with every passing year. A major war against Britain, fought across an ocean, would cost a staggering amount of money that France did not have and would have to borrow. Louis XVI did it anyway. At first, France helped quietly, funneling weapons and money to the rebels through unofficial channels, technically maintaining neutrality while practically taking sides. Then, after the Americans demonstrated at Saratoga in 1777 that they could actually defeat a British army in the field, France committed openly. A formal alliance was signed in 1778. French money poured across the Atlantic. French weapons armed the Continental Army. The Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman who had crossed the ocean at his own expense the year before because he believed in the American cause, became one of Washington's most trusted commanders and the human symbol of French investment in American liberty. Then came Yorktown. In the autumn of 1781, a combined force of American and French troops cornered a British army under General Cornwallis on a peninsula in Virginia. Cornwallis was not simply outnumbered on land. He was sealed off from rescue and resupply at sea by a French fleet that had sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and beaten the British Navy back. The French ships held the water. The American and French soldiers held the land. Cornwallis had nowhere to go. On the 19th of October, 1781, he surrendered. Yorktown effectively ended the war. American independence was secured, and the key that unlocked it, the thing that made the final trap possible, was the French fleet blocking the Chesapeake. Here is the fact that most Americans carry in some vague form but rarely confront directly. The United States did not win its independence alone. It won with French money. French weapons, French soldiers, and a French navy, all funded by a king who was draining a treasury that was already bleeding. France won its revenge on Britain. The humiliation of the 7 Years' War was answered. Lafayette came home a hero, carrying with him the infectious conviction that the ideas of the American Revolution, liberty, rights, the consent of the governed, were not just good ideas for a distant former colony, but urgent ideas for France itself. And here is where the story turns. And the irony becomes something almost too large to hold in a single thought. France had bankrupted itself to fund a revolution against a monarchy, and in the process, it had sent tens of thousands of its own soldiers and sailors to fight alongside men who believed that kings were not necessary, that people had natural rights, that no crown could override, that a nation could govern itself without a royal family at the top of it. Those men came home to France carrying those ideas in their heads. And they came home to a country that was broke, unequal, and ruled by an absolute king who lived in a palace full of mirrors. The debt was bad enough. The ideas were worse. Not because the ideas were wrong, but because France had just proven, by helping win the American war, that they could work. The American Republic was not a theory anymore. It was a country. It was functioning. It had defeated the most powerful empire in the world. And the Frenchmen who had helped make that happen were now home in Paris, talking about it in the coffee houses and the salons and the streets, asking the question that the monarchy had no good answer to. If Americans could do it, why not us? The French monarchy had spent a fortune. It did not have to answer its old enemy and settle an old score. It had won. And in winning, it had handed its own people the argument that would be used to destroy it. France built a bonfire out of debt and resentment, and 100 years of a court that had stopped looking out its own windows. The American war soaked that bonfire in something that burned even hotter than money. It handed the people the spark. All it needed now was a face to put on the fire. A single person, the whole angry, hungry, indebted country could point to and say, "That one, she is the reason." And France already had her, a foreign queen who spent money, who had come from an old enemy country, and who was about to discover what it meant to be chosen as the symbol of everything a nation had decided to hate. Let them eat cake. You know the line. You know the story. The Queen of France was told the people had no bread, and she looked up from whatever she was doing and said, in words that have defined her for 2 centuries, "Well then, let them eat cake instead." Heartless, clueless, the perfect encapsulation of a ruling class so removed from reality that it could not conceive of a world where ordinary people did not simply choose between bread and pastry. There is one problem with this story. She almost certainly never said it. The line appears in writing years before Marie Antoinette was ever Queen of France. A version of it was already circulating, attributed to some unnamed great princess, when Marie Antoinette was still a child in Austria, with no connection to France at all. The quote was old, a stock insult that people had pinned on pampered royalty for generations. The kind of line that floated through political satire and attached itself wherever it found a convenient target. It was pinned on Marie Antoinette later, after she had already become the villain the story needed, because by then people were ready to believe anything about her. And a line that old and that cutting fit perfectly. The most famous thing she ever said is something she never said. That gap between What the world believes about Marie Antoinette and what was actually true is the whole story. To understand what really happened to her, you have to separate the person from the symbol. And the first thing to understand about the symbol is that it was built before she did anything to deserve it. She arrived in France at 14. A girl from the Austrian imperial family sent across a border to cement an alliance between two countries that had spent most of the previous 2 centuries trying to destroy each other. The ceremony at the border was designed to make the point explicit. Everything she had brought from Austria had to be left behind. Her clothes, her books, her jewelry, the small dog she had been allowed to carry as far as the frontier. Even her Austrian attendants were not permitted to cross into France with her. She walked into a special pavilion built on an island in the middle of the Rhine, took off her Austrian clothes, and came out the other side in French ones, surrounded by French servants, heading toward a French palace. A 14-year-old girl who had just been formally required to stop being Austrian. France never quite let her finish becoming French. From the moment she arrived at Versailles, she was the Austrian, the foreigner, the woman who came from the country France, had fought and feared and resented for generations. No matter what she did, no matter how carefully she studied the etiquette or how gracefully she carried herself in public, there was a corner of the French court and a much larger corner of the French public that had already decided she was not one of them and never would be. They gave her a nickname behind her back, a word that meant the Austrian woman, and the contempt in it was deliberate and consistent and never went away. So she did what trapped people do. She built a world she could actually control. She was young, far from home, married to a husband who was kind but awkward, and who gave her little of the companionship she needed. She had no real political power. Her role was to look beautiful, to behave correctly in public, and eventually to produce an heir. In the meantime, there was a vast empty space in her days, and she filled it with the things that were available to her: fashion, gambling, a small circle of close friends who gave her warmth and laughter, and the feeling of being known as a person rather than a symbol, music and theatre, and the particular pleasure of creating a beautiful, immediate environment when the larger world was not available to choose. And she spent money on all of it. She was not uniquely extravagant by the standards of Versailles, a palace that had been a monument to excess for 100 years before she arrived. Her wardrobe was expensive, but French queens before her had kept expensive wardrobes without becoming national villains for it. The gambling debts were real but not exceptional. What was different was the timing, and timing, in matters like this, is everything. France was going broke. The treasury that had been draining since the Sun King's wars was now almost empty, and the people who bore the heaviest burden of filling it, the farmers and labourers and tradespeople who paid the taxes that the nobility avoided, were feeling the pressure in ways that made the sight of a foreign queen spending money on gowns genuinely maddening. They started calling her Madame Deficit. The name spread through the pamphlets and the coffee houses and the streets of Paris. She was the face of the empty treasury, the woman whose spending had taken the bread off ordinary tables, the Austrian who had come to France to bleed it dry. It was not accurate. The treasury had been bleeding for decades before she arrived, for reasons that had nothing to do with her wardrobe. The debt came from wars, from a tax system designed to protect the rich, from the cost of funding the American Revolution. One queen's dresses were a drop in that ocean, but accuracy was not what the moment wanted. The moment wanted a villain. Then came the scandal that turned suspicion into certainty. And the cruelest part of it is that she was innocent. It is called The affair of the diamond necklace. And it was a swindle. A group of con artists devised a scheme involving a spectacularly expensive necklace, one of the most valuable pieces of jewelry in Europe, and they used the Queen's name to execute it. They convinced a vain and ambitious cardinal that Marie Antoinette secretly wanted the necklace and would reward him lavishly if he purchased it on her behalf. He bought it. The con artists took the diamonds and vanished. When the fraud unraveled, it became the most sensational public scandal in France in a generation. Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with any of it. She had not requested the necklace, had not authorized anything, had never communicated with the Cardinal, had been used by criminals who understood that her reputation was the most exploitable thing in France. None of that mattered. The public had already decided what kind of woman she was, and the scandal confirmed it perfectly. She was exactly the corrupt, grasping, dishonest Austrian they had always suspected. The verdict arrived before the evidence was examined, and no amount of evidence changed it afterward. This is what it means to become a symbol. The real Marie Antoinette, a woman with genuine flaws and genuine qualities, who could be frivolous and could also be perceptive, who was a devoted mother and who grew more serious and more composed as everything around her disintegrated. That woman disappeared almost completely behind the symbol. In her place stood Madame Deficit, the heartless Austrian, the face of everything wrong with the monarchy, the person France had chosen to carry all of its rage. She did not fully understand, for a long time, how much danger this put her in. Few people at Versailles did. The court still reflected only itself. The mirrors still showed the same gilded world they had always shown. From inside the palace, the anger outside was something to be read about in reports, not something that felt real, not something that felt like it could actually reach through the walls and take you. The walls would not hold, but before they broke, France needed one more ingredient. It needed to discover that the king himself could not fix what was wrong. Not because he was cruel or corrupt or indifferent, but for a reason that was in some ways more devastating than any of those. The king was simply the wrong man, at the worst possible moment, for a job that might have been impossible for anyone. Versailles, a workshop on the upper floor of the palace. The King of France was on his knees on the floor, fitting a piece of metal into a lock mechanism, and he was happy. This was where Louis XVI made the most sense. Not in the council chamber, not at the head of a table full of ministers arguing about money and war and the price of bread. Here, in a small room with tools on the walls and metal shavings on the floor, with a mechanism in front of him that had a specific problem with a specific solution. He had set up a proper workshop at Versailles, equipped with the tools of a skilled craftsman, and he spent real time there, not as a hobby in the way that powerful men sometimes pick up hobbies to appear human, but with the genuine focus of someone who found this kind of work satisfying in a way that the rest of his life rarely was. He was good at it. He could take a complicated lock apart, understand the exact relationship between each of its parts, identify what was binding or worn or misaligned, fix it, and put it back together so that it worked better than before. With metal in his hands, he was patient and precise and confident. He knew what he was doing. A lock has rules. Follow the rules and the lock works. Break one piece and you can find the break and repair it. The mechanism does not lie to you, does not flatter you, does not pursue its own agenda. It is what it is. And if you are careful and knowledgeable and willing to take the time, You can understand it completely. A kingdom sliding toward revolution is not a lock. Louis XVI was, by almost every honest account, a decent man. He was intelligent in a quiet, bookish way, well read in history and geography and science. A king who took his responsibilities seriously and prayed about them and worried about them and wanted, genuinely, to govern well. He was kind to the people around him in small, specific, unperformed ways. He was a devoted father. He cared about his subjects in a real, if distant sense. The way a person cares about people they have never met, but feel responsible for. What he lacked was the one thing the moment required above all others. He could not project authority. He could not dominate a room, command a crisis, or force his will onto events that were moving faster than his deliberate mind could track. He was shy. He was physically awkward in public, uncertain of his hands and his face in the way that some people simply are, unable to perform confidence when they do not feel it. He hated confrontation and went to considerable lengths to avoid it. When decisions came to him that had no good answer, when every option was bad and someone had to choose anyway, Louis would hesitate, reconsider, delay, and frequently end up choosing nothing, or choosing and then reversing himself days later when the pressure from the other direction arrived. In ordinary times, a gentle and cautious king might muddle through. These were not ordinary times. The financial crisis that Louis XVI inherited had been building since the Sun King's Wars, compounding through Louis XV's long avoidance, and now landing on a young king who had the misfortune of being honest enough to see it clearly. The monarchy was running out of money, not slowly, not gradually, but on a visible timeline that his finance ministers could calculate, and did calculate, and brought to him in reports that all said the same thing. The debt was unsustainable. The interest alone was consuming more than half of all royal revenue. The treasury was heading toward a wall, and the speed was increasing. The solution was not a mystery. Every serious person who looked at the problem arrived at the same answer. France had to fix its tax system. The nobility and the clergy, the two groups that held most of the country's wealth, had to be made to pay their share. The ancient exemptions that protected the rich while the poor carried the entire burden had to end. This was not a radical idea. It was arithmetic. Louis understood this. He appointed ministers who understood it and who had real plans to implement it. He backed them, at least at first, and then the nobility fought back, fiercely and effectively, defending their privileges with every legal and political tool available to them. The Parliament, the high courts that had to register royal decrees to make them law, refused to cooperate. The great nobles made clear they would resist. The church objected, and Louis, confronted with organized resistance from the most powerful people in the kingdom, the people he saw at dinner, the people whose approval made daily life at Versailles tolerable, lost his nerve and retreated. The reform minister would be dismissed. A less threatening replacement would be found. The cycle would begin again. It happened more than once, more than twice. Each time, the underlying problem got worse, while the attempted solution was abandoned. The ministers who could have saved the monarchy were used up one after another, each one exhausted by a king who supported them until the moment supporting them became uncomfortable, and then withdrew. By the late 1780s, the list of dismissed reformers was long enough to constitute its own indictment. And yet, there are moments in Louis XVI's reign that show you something else, something that makes the whole story harder and sadder than a simple tale of royal incompetence. In 1781, when the American War had just ended and France was deep in debt from funding it, a royal finance minister published a public accounting of the royal finances, the first time in French history that the government's books had been open to public scrutiny. It was a genuinely radical act of transparency, and Louis approved it. The accounting was not entirely honest. It underplayed the deficit. But the impulse behind it, the idea that the public had a right to know how their money was being spent, was more modern than almost anything the monarchy had done in 100 years. He freed the serfs on royal lands. He abolished torture as an instrument of judicial investigation. He supported inoculation against smallpox at a time when the practice was still controversial. These were not the acts of a man who did not care. They were the acts of a man who knew what was right and could act on it when acting on it did not require him to fight the people around him. The tragedy of Louis XVI is not that he was evil or stupid. The tragedy is that he was a decent, limited man handed a broken system at the exact moment the system needed someone extraordinary to fix it. A man who could repair locks with patience and skill and genuine competence was left trying to repair a kingdom that could not be taken apart piece by piece and put back together in a small room with the door closed. Cornered. Out of options. Having tried and abandoned more finance ministers than most kings saw in an entire reign, he finally made the decision that would change everything. He agreed to call together the Estates General, an ancient representative body that had not met in over 150 years, to help him solve the crisis. He thought he was asking the nation for help. He did not understand that he was opening a door he would never be able to close again. Behind that door was not a nation ready to help its king. Behind that door was a nation that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Patient and furious and full of ideas about what France should be, ideas that had very little room in them for an absolute monarchy, a golden palace, and a foreign queen with a reputation she had not entirely earned. He opened the door in the spring of 1789. Versailles, May 1789. The representatives of France arrived at the palace of their king, and almost immediately the whole thing broke apart over a question that sounded procedural and turned out to be everything. How would they vote? The Estates General divided France into 3 orders. The clergy were the first estate, the nobility were the second, and the third estate was everyone else, which meant roughly 97 out of every 100 people in the country, represented by lawyers, merchants, doctors, educated professionals, men of the middle class who had travelled to Versailles from towns and villages all across France, carrying written lists of grievances from the communities that sent them. They had been given a voice. The question was how much that voice was worth. Under the traditional rules, each estate voted as a block. 1 vote for the clergy, 1 vote for the nobility, 1 vote for everyone else, which meant the 2 privileged orders, who together represented perhaps 3% of France, could always combine to outvote the 97% that was the third estate. The commoners had a seat at the table and no power at it. The third estate refused to accept this. They had not travelled to Versailles to be decorative. They demanded that voting be counted by head, all representatives together, where their numbers would actually determine outcomes. The privileged orders refused. The king, true to form, signalled different things to different people and committed clearly to nothing. The whole assembly ground into deadlock before it had done anything at all. Then the third estate stopped waiting for permission. In June of 1789, The common representatives declared themselves something entirely new. They were no longer just the Third Estate, one block among three. They were the National Assembly, the legitimate representatives of the French nation. They were claiming, out loud, in writing, in Versailles itself, that sovereignty, the real authority to govern France, did not belong to the king alone. It belonged to the people. This was not a petition. It was not a request. It was a declaration that the entire foundation of absolute monarchy was wrong. The king's response was to lock them out. A few days later, the representatives arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors shut and soldiers posted in front of them. Whatever the king's actual intention, it looked exactly like what it felt like, the crown moving to crush the new assembly before it could act. The representatives did not go home. They found another room, a large indoor court used for a ball game called jeu de paume, and they crowded inside and they swore an oath that no king of France had faced before. They swore they would not disperse. They would keep meeting in whatever space was available until France had a constitution, a written document that would define what the king could and could not do. In a sports hall with no furniture, the representatives of the French people told the most powerful monarch in Europe that his will alone was no longer the law of the land. And they meant it. Louis, as always, could not decide what to do. He ordered them to stop meeting. They met. He ordered the privileged estates to join them. Some did. He moved troops toward Paris and Versailles, which terrified everyone, then stopped moving them, which reassured no one. He managed to frighten the revolutionaries without suppressing them, and to reassure the court without actually resolving anything. Every move he made left him more isolated than the one before. And then Paris did not wait for the king to make up his mind. The city had been watching everything at Versailles with the focused attention of people who understood that what was decided 12 miles away would determine whether they could afford to feed their children. Paris was hungry. Bread prices had been climbing for months, driven up by a bad harvest the previous year, until a single loaf cost a working family a significant fraction of everything they earned in a day. The streets were full of people who were frightened and angry, and had been frightened and angry for long enough that the fear had burned away, and only the anger was left. When word spread that the king was massing troops, possibly preparing to shut down the assembly by force, the city decided to arm itself. On the 14th of July, 1789, a crowd marched on the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of Paris, thick, walled, and towered, and for generations it had stood as the most visible symbol of royal power in the city, the place where the crown could imprison anyone it chose by personal decree. No trial required, no explanation owed. It was not, on that particular July morning, full of political prisoners. It held 7 men, most of them there on ordinary criminal charges. The crowd came for the gunpowder stored inside, not for the prisoners. But symbols do not work by inventory. The standoff turned violent. The fortress commander fired on the crowd. People died in the courtyard. The fighting lasted hours. And then the Bastille fell. The crowd surged in. The governor was seized and killed, his head carried through the streets on a pike, in an act of violence that shocked even many of the people who had supported storming the fortress. But the fortress had fallen. The most powerful symbol of royal authority in Paris had been taken by the people, and not by an army, by a crowd of ordinary Parisians who had decided they were done being afraid. Word moved across France and across Europe with the speed of something that changes the world. The Bastille had fallen. The king's power had been openly challenged in the streets and had lost. The idea that the monarchy was untouchable, that the crown's authority was something ordinary people simply had to accept, had been broken in an afternoon in July. There is a detail from that exact day that says everything about the distance between the palace and the country. Louis XVI kept a hunting diary, a simple record of his days out in the field. On the 14th of July, 1789, the day the Bastille fell and the French Revolution began, he made his entry for the day. He had not gone out. He had taken no game. He wrote a single word. Nothing. He was not being callous. He genuinely did not understand. Sitting in Versailles, 12 miles away. What had happened in Paris that afternoon? The world had cracked open, and from inside the palace that had been built to reflect only itself, the King of France looked at his day and saw nothing worth recording. 3 months later, France came to collect him on the 5th of October, 1789. Thousands of women left Paris and marched to Versailles in the rain. They were hungry and they were done asking politely for bread, and they had decided that the solution to having a king who did not understand their lives was to go and get him and bring him somewhere he could see those lives more directly. They marched for miles through the rain, and they arrived at the palace, and some of them forced their way inside. And for several terrifying hours, the royal family was in genuine danger in their own home. The violence reaching the Queen's own apartments before the guards restored order, and then the crowd made its demand. The royal family had to come back to Paris. Not visit, move. Live where the people could see them and where the people could watch. Louis agreed. He had no real choice. The next day, the King and Queen of France climbed into a carriage, surrounded by tens of thousands of armed and triumphant people, and were escorted away from Versailles, the palace that Louis XIV had built to keep the monarchy safe from exactly this kind of thing. The vast machine designed to hold Paris at a comfortable distance went quiet behind them. They left the mirrors behind. They left the gardens. They left the hall where the light bounced back from every surface and showed the king nothing but himself. They were going to Paris, to the city that 2 kings before them had feared and fled. And they were going because the people had come and taken them. The mirror was cracking, and on the other side of it, the guillotine was already being built. Paris, the night of June 20th, 1791. A little after midnight, a large man in a grey coat and a wide-brimmed hat walked out of the Tuileries Palace, climbed into a waiting coach, and tried to disappear. He was the King of France, and he was running for almost 2 years now. Louis and his family had been living in Paris, in the Tuileries Palace, under the watchful and increasingly suspicious eye of the revolution. On the surface, the king had been cooperating. He had accepted the National Assembly. He had agreed, in public and in writing, to become a constitutional monarch, a king whose power was defined and limited by law. He had signed documents and attended ceremonies and performed, with reasonable skill, the part of a ruler who had embraced the new France. He had not embraced it. He found it monstrous. Louis was a deeply religious man, and the revolution had done things to the Catholic Church in France that he considered sinful. It had seized church lands. It had forced priests to swear loyalty to the new civil order rather than to Rome, and the priests who refused were being driven out of their parishes. Louis had signed the decree requiring this oath, and his conscience had been tormenting him ever since. He believed his public agreement with the revolution was a lie, And for a man who took his faith seriously, living inside that lie was becoming unbearable. He also believed, with growing conviction, that the only way to save France and his family was to get out of Paris and reach the part of the country where loyal troops were still waiting. From there, with an army at his back and beyond the reach of the Paris mob, he could negotiate on different terms. Or, if negotiation failed, he could fight. He was not planning to flee France. He was planning to reach a fortress town near the border, a place called Montmedy, and deal with the revolution from a position of strength instead of captivity. The plan had been months in preparation, and it had one quality that distinguished it from all the better plans that could have been made. It was too complicated. The royal family would travel together, which required a large carriage. A berline, heavy and slow. They would travel in disguise. As a family of servants accompanying a wealthy Russian noblewoman, a role played by one of the Queen's ladies. The carriage was fitted with special compartments and special equipment, food and wine, and a complete travelling wardrobe. The preparation was meticulous in the way that preparations are when the people making them are more comfortable with ceremony than with speed. They left the Tuileries just after midnight, slipping out in small groups through different exits. The children first with their governess, then the Queen, then the King. The Queen got briefly lost in the dark streets outside the palace, wandering for precious minutes in the wrong direction before finding the carriage. By the time they were all aboard and moving, they were already late. The carriage moved east through the sleeping countryside, and with every hour it fell further behind schedule. Detachments of loyal cavalry had been posted along the route to protect the king, with instructions to meet him at specific points at specific times. As the heavy coach lumbered on, slower than any plan had accounted for, the waiting soldiers grew nervous. An hour passed, then 2, then 3 beyond what they had been told to expect. On by on. The cavalry detachments concluded that something had gone wrong, that the plan had failed, and the king was not coming, and they dispersed to avoid attracting attention. The chain of protection that was supposed to guide the royal family to safety quietly fell apart behind them, link by link, because a berline loaded with royal luggage moved at the speed of a berline loaded with royal luggage. And then there was the face. It turned out to be a serious problem that the King of France was one of the most recognizable faces in the country. His profile was on every coin. His portrait hung in every government building. In a small town called Saint Menehould, the royal carriage stopped to change horses, and a man there, the local postmaster, looked through the window at the large grey-coated traveller inside. The face was familiar. He looked again. He looked at the coin in his pocket and at the face in the carriage. He was not completely certain, but he was certain enough. He saddled a horse and rode hard for the next town, a place called Versailles, to get there before the carriage could pass through. At Versailles, late at night, the carriage was stopped. Local officials and armed townspeople blocked the road and demanded to see the traveller's papers. The papers were in order. The disguise was intact, and for a few minutes it seemed like it might hold. Then a former royal official, who had been called to the scene, looked at the man in the grey coat and recognized him with no uncertainty at all. The largest, most elaborately planned secret in France had come undone in a small town at midnight because a postmaster had a good memory and a horse. The king was caught. The journey back to Paris was the punishment, and it was the kind of punishment that does not mark the body, but changes everything. The royal family was escorted home slowly, over several days. Through the heat of late June, surrounded by an ever-growing escort of National Guardsmen and revolutionary officials, and along every mile of that route, the country watched its king go by. The crowds that gathered did not cheer. In many places they did not even remove their hats. A simple gesture of respect that subjects had always shown their king, and the refusal of it was deliberate and pointed and unmistakable. Some people jeered. Some were simply silent in a way that was worse than jeering. The anointed King of France, the sacred ruler by divine right, was being paraded through his own kingdom like a captured fugitive, and his own people were declining to take off their hats before Varennes. France had been able to tell itself a comfortable story. The king was a good man who had been pushed into an impossible position. The revolution and the monarchy could coexist. Louis was with the people even if the people around him were not. The flight destroyed that story in a single night. By running, Louis had answered every question about where his loyalties actually lay. He had tried to escape the revolution, tried to reach an army, tried to reach the border. He had left behind a written declaration, condemning everything the revolution had done, removing any ambiguity about what he truly felt. The king was not a reluctant partner in the new France. The king was its prisoner and its enemy. Once the people understood that, and after Varennes, they could not ununderstand it. The monarchy as an idea was finished. You cannot have a constitutional king who despises the constitution and has to be hunted down the road and brought back. The trust was gone, and in revolutionary politics, when trust dies, the ground shifts beneath everyone's feet, and the most radical voice in the room starts to sound like the most honest one. Louis was brought back to the Tuileries under heavy guard. A prisoner, in fact, if not yet in name. And the fiction of the willing constitutional monarch staggered on for a while longer, because no one was quite ready for what came next. But the life had left it. The revolution was entering a new phase now. Faster and darker and less interested in compromise. And the man at the center of it all was a king who had just proven he would run if he could find a way out. He would not find another way out. Paris, January 21st, 1793. On a cold grey morning, a closed carriage moved through streets lined with soldiers and took the former King of France to a large, open square where a wooden machine was waiting for him. The trial had lasted days. The outcome had been decided before it started. The National Convention, the body that now governed France, had put Louis on trial for treason, for conspiring against the nation he had sworn to serve, for his secret communications with foreign enemies, for the flight to Varennes. Among the most damaging evidence was a hidden iron safe discovered in the walls of the Tuileries, containing documents that showed, in Louis's own hand and over his own seal, the private correspondence of a man who had been telling the revolution one thing and working toward the opposite. The case, in the end, was not complicated. The king had lied to France about who he was and what he intended. The vote on the sentence was close, and it was agonizing, and it took all night. And when it was done, the result was death, by a margin that history has argued over ever since. A different handful of votes, and Louis XVI might have lived out his days in prison or in exile, and the whole subsequent history of France and Europe might have run differently. But the handful of votes went the way they went. And on the morning of the 21st of January, 1793, the king was told what was coming. He had asked to see a priest in his final days, and the request had been granted. He had spent hours in prayer and in the preparation that a religious man makes for the end. He had been allowed a final meeting with his family, his wife, his sister, his 2 children. In the temple tower, where they were all being held, the accounts from the guards who were present describe something almost impossible to read. The family held each other. Louis comforted them. He asked his young son, if the boy ever came to power, to forgive the men responsible for his father's death. Then he sent them away, because he knew that seeing them again in the morning would break something in him that he needed to hold together. He held it together. The ride through Paris in the closed carriage took about an hour, and Louis spent it with the priest, praying and reading from the Psalms. Outside the windows, the city was silent in an unusual way, the silence of a great many people who were not sure what they were about to witness or how they would feel about it afterward. The soldiers, lining the route, stood at attention. The crowds watched. At the Place de la Révolution, which had been the Place Louis Quinze before the Revolution, renamed it, and would be the Place de la Concorde after this day had been absorbed into history. The scaffold stood with the guillotine mounted on it. The machine was a product of revolutionary principle. It killed swiftly, mechanically, and identically, regardless of the status of the condemned. The same blade for a pickpocket and a king. Death made equal by engineering. Louis climbed the steps. By the accounts of witnesses, he tried to speak to the crowd. He said he was innocent of the crimes charged against him. He said he forgave the men responsible for his death. He had begun to say something about hoping his blood would not fall back on France when the drums began. An officer had ordered them to roll, and the sound of them rose over his voice and drowned it out. And the last words of the King of France were lost in the noise of drums that had been started specifically to make certain no one could hear them. The blade came down. An assistant held up the severed head of Louis XVI for the crowd to see, and a roar went up from the square, and people surged forward to press handkerchiefs against the blood on the scaffold, to take away some fragment of the most extraordinary moment most of them would ever witness. The king, who had tinkered with locks in his workshop at Versailles, who had read widely and meant well, and could not make himself fight for the things that needed fighting for, was dead at 38, and the monarchy of France was over. The killing did not stop with him. The revolution was moving into the phase remembered as the Terror, a period in which the new republic, gripped by genuine fear of enemies on its borders and suspected enemies within, began executing people by the hundreds and then by the thousands. The guillotine worked every day in that square. The blade that had taken the king now took aristocrats, priests, generals, politicians, and ordinary people denounced by their neighbors on evidence that would not have convinced a reasonable court in any stable country. France was consuming itself in a machinery of suspicion that no one inside it knew how to slow down. In the prison, called the Temple, Marie Antoinette waited. She had already lost her husband. She had already lost her son. The little boy the revolutionaries had taken from her and placed in a separate cell, working to make him useful to their purposes in ways that constituted one of the cruelest things the revolution did, in a period not short on cruelty. She would die without seeing him again. She was 37 years old, and the months of imprisonment had aged her in ways visible to everyone who saw her. Her hair had gone white. She was thin and ill, and carried herself with a composure that was clearly costing her something real to maintain. They brought her to trial in October of 1793. The charges included treason and conspiracy with foreign enemies, charges that had a basis in fact. Then the prosecutor introduced an accusation involving her son, a claim so vile and so unsupported by any evidence that it had clearly been included for its effect rather than its truth. When it was read aloud in the courtroom, Marie Antoinette did not respond immediately. She sat with it. Then she turned away from her accusers and spoke to the women in the public gallery, the ordinary French women who had come to watch the trial, and she said that nature itself recoils from such a charge against any mother, and that she appealed to every mother present. The courtroom went quiet for one moment. In the middle of a proceeding designed to execute a symbol, the symbol cracked and the person showed through. The women in the gallery felt it. The room felt it. And then it passed. And the trial continued. And the verdict came in as everyone had known it would. She was executed on the 16th of October, 1793. She rode to the scaffold in an open cart, her hands bound behind her, her hair cut short, so that the crowd lining the route could see her clearly. She had accepted what was coming with a steadiness that her enemies could not deny, and her defenders still find remarkable. At the scaffold, climbing the steps, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner. She turned to him. Her last recorded words were an apology. Pardon, monsieur. I did not do it on purpose. The training of a lifetime. Every lesson about correct behavior in the presence of others. The manners that had been drilled into her from childhood in the Austrian imperial court and polished to a fine edge in 23 years at Versailles. All of it was still running, still operating on instinct. At the exact moment when nothing about correct behavior could possibly matter anymore, then the blade came down on the Queen of France, the little boy, the child the royalists called Louis XVII, never left the temple. He was held there in conditions that worsened as the months passed, isolated from the people who loved him, poorly fed and poorly cared for. A child of 8 and then 9 and then 10, kept alive in a stone tower and given nothing to live for. He died there in June of 1795, 10 years old, the uncrowned king who never had a kingdom and never had a chance. So in the space of 2 years, the senior line of the House of Bourbon lost everything. The king, dead. The queen, dead. Their son, dead in a tower. The dynasty that Henry IV had built on compromise and patience and a willingness to become what France needed. That Richelieu had turned into a machine. That the Sun King had raised to a height of glory so extreme that it became its own kind of blindness, was gone from the throne of France. This is what the pits at St. Denis were for. This is what the lime was for. The rage that tore open the royal tombs was the same rage that had built the guillotine and fed it for 2 years. A country that had killed its king and its queen did not want their ancestors resting peacefully underground as if none of it had happened. It wanted them erased, all the way down. But the family was not entirely gone. Somewhere in the courts of Europe, 2 brothers of the dead king were alive and in exile, carrying the bloodline and the claim and the burning certainty that this was not the end, that France would come back to them, that the Bourbons were not finished. They were right, but the France that came back to them would not be the France they had lost. And the distance between the France they remembered and the France that actually existed would prove to be the thing that finally, permanently, closed the door. Hartwell House, Buckinghamshire, England, the winter of 1812. On a cold morning in the English countryside, a fat man with gout sat in a borrowed house and opened a newspaper from Paris, and read about the man who had stolen his country. His name was Louis Stanislas Xavier, and by his own reckoning he was Louis XVIII, the rightful king of France. He was 57 years old, and he had been in exile for most of the past 2 decades. moving from court to court across Europe as politics shifted and hospitality ran out, until the British had given him this house. Hartwell, a draughty English manor in Buckinghamshire that was larger than what most exiles got and smaller than what a king was supposed to have. He lived there with a small court of aging French nobles who had fled the Revolution, people who dressed and spoke and organized their days as if Versailles still existed, as if the world that had ended 20 years ago might resume at any moment if they simply kept the habits going. Every morning the newspaper came from Paris. Every morning Louis read about Napoleon. This was the specific torment of the exile. Napoleon Bonaparte had done what Louis had spent 20 years waiting to do. He had taken France and made it magnificent again, had rebuilt the army and the economy and the prestige, had won battles that made every other general in Europe look slow, had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame and placed his family on thrones across the continent. The man who had no royal blood, no Dynasty, no claim to anything except what his own will had manufactured, was living in the palaces that the Bourbons had built, sleeping in their beds, receiving the ambassadors who used to call on their ancestors. Louis read about all of it in his newspaper, in his borrowed English house. In a country that was polite to him and would never be his, he could not have been more different from his younger brother, the Count of Artois, who was also in exile and who experienced it very differently. Artois was still handsome, still certain, still absolutely convinced that the Bourbons needed only to return and restore everything exactly as it had been, that the revolution was a temporary madness that France would recover from and repent of, that the old monarchy, in its full glory, was what the country truly wanted and would accept with gratitude when the time came. He had learned nothing and lost nothing except his address, and he wore his certainty like a suit of armor. Louis was not like that. Louis was a realist in the way that men become realists, when they have sat in borrowed rooms for 20 years, watching the world make other arrangements. He understood that France in 1812 was not France in 1789. He understood that the people who had grown up under the Revolution, who had fought in Napoleon's armies and reorganized their lives around the institutions the Revolution had built, were not simply waiting for a king to come home and restore the old order. He understood that going back meant going back to a France that had changed, and that a king who refused to acknowledge the change would not last long in the new France. He kept this understanding mostly to himself, because it was not what the court of exiles at Hartwell wanted to hear. They wanted reassurance. They wanted someone to tell them that patience would be rewarded with restoration, that the world they had lost was recoverable, that France would come to its senses and send for its rightful king. Louis gave them enough of that to keep the little court together, and he kept the realism in reserve, a private resource for the moment when it would actually be needed. He was right that the moment would come. He was just wrong about what it would cost to be ready for it. In 1812, the moment still felt distant. Napoleon was at the height of his power. His empire stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. His family sat on thrones across Europe. His armies had beaten every coalition the old monarchies could assemble against him. Anyone placing a reasonable bet on the future of France in 1812 would not have bet on the fat man in the English country house. But Louis kept reading the newspapers, kept his small court running, kept himself available for a France that was not yet ready for him, with the patience of a man who had nothing else to do but wait, and who had become very good at waiting. He was about to get his chance. And the newspaper that arrived one morning in the spring of 1813 would begin to tell him why. Napoleon had gone to Russia. The army he had taken east the largest assembled in modern European history, had gone in and not come back, had been swallowed by the distances and the winter and the burning of Moscow and the long starving retreat across frozen ground. What staggered home was a remnant, frostbitten and broken, and the spell that had held Europe in terrified submission for a decade had broken with it. The nations that had been beaten into alliance or submission began to move. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Britain, the coalition that had failed so many times before, formed again. And this time it held. And this time it advanced. And in the spring of 1814, it marched into Paris. Napoleon was finished. He signed his abdication and was sent to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. Comfortable exile for the man who had remade the world. And the great powers of Europe looked at the empty throne of France and agreed, after some discussion, that the most stable solution was the obvious one. Bring back the Bourbons. Louis XVIII left Hartwell on the 20th of April, 1814. After 19 years of exile, he was nearly 60, barely able to walk because of the gout, and he travelled slowly. He stopped in London for ceremonies and celebrations. He was received at every stage with the honours due a returning king. And when he crossed into France for the first time in nearly 2 decades, and the people came out to see him, something complicated moved through the crowds along the road. There was relief, genuine relief. The exhaustion of a country that had been at war almost continuously for 20 years and wanted it to end. There was curiosity, the desire to see this man, who had been a name and a claim for so long. There was, in some places, genuine royalist enthusiasm from people who had never stopped believing. And there was, underneath all of it, in the silence of people who watched without cheering, something harder to name, a wariness, a wait-and-see quality. A country that had been through too much to give its heart away again without knowing what it was getting. Louis understood the wariness. He had read about France in the newspapers for 20 years. He had watched it change from a distance and thought carefully about what the change meant. He was going home to a France that had buried the world he grew up in. And he knew it. The question was whether knowing it would be enough. Paris, the spring of 1814. The king who came home understood more than most people expected him to, and less than he needed to. Louis XVIII had spent 19 years thinking about France, reading about France, waiting for France, and he had arrived at a position that was genuinely more flexible than anyone who knew only his brother, the Count of Artois, would have predicted. He was willing to compromise. He agreed to a charter, a written document that granted French citizens rights and created an elected assembly with a real role in governance. He kept many of the practical institutions the revolution had built. He accepted that the France of 1789 was not coming back, and he said so, in terms that surprised people who had expected a simple restoration of the old order. What he could not quite do was make France believe him. The problem was not what he said. The problem was how he arrived. Louis XVIII had been returned to the French throne by the armies of Russia, Britain, Prussia, and Austria. He had not won France back. He had been placed back by the foreign powers that had defeated the man France had actually chosen to lead it. Every French person who had served in Napoleon's armies, which was most of the young men in the country, every French person who had grown up in the decade and a half when France was winning, understood at some level that the king in the Tuileries was there because France had lost a war. The crown had been handed back to the Bourbons by the enemies of France as part of a peace settlement. It was the kind of homecoming that is hard to celebrate without feeling a little ashamed of what made it necessary. Louis governed carefully. He tried to hold the center against pressure from both sides, from the royalists who wanted the old regime fully restored, and from the liberals who wanted the Charter's promises taken seriously. He was, within his limits, a skillful politician, and he might have found a sustainable balance. Then Napoleon came back. In March of 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, landed in southern France, and marched north. The soldiers sent to stop him greeted him instead. The army that was supposed to defend the restored monarchy walked off the field and joined the man it had followed across Europe for a decade. Louis XVIII fled Paris for the second time in his life, bundled into a carriage in the dark, heading north toward the Belgian border. It lasted 100 days. Napoleon met the Allied armies at Waterloo in June of 1815, and the French lost. And Napoleon was sent, this time, to St. Helena, a tiny island in the South Atlantic, as far from France as the Allied powers could manage. And Louis XVIII came back. Again. Restored a second time. Carried home in the baggage of foreign armies that had beaten France twice in 2 years. It was not a dignified way to return to a throne. Twice driven out. Twice brought back by enemies. Whatever legitimacy the restoration had started with was thinner now, stretched by the 100 days into something that covered less ground than before. And then Louis XVIII did the thing that reveals the deepest truth about what the Bourbons understood and what they could not understand. He went looking for his dead. He had not forgotten what the Revolution had done at Saint Denis. He knew about the men with crowbars and the open pits and the lime. He knew that the kings of France, his predecessors, his family, the whole sacred line, going back 1,000 years, had been dragged out of their tombs and dissolved. To Louis, restoring the monarchy meant restoring everything, including the proper burial of the dead, including the dignity of the graves. He gave the order, go back to St. Denis, recover what is there. Bring the kings home. The workers went out to the churchyard, and they dug. What they found was almost nothing anyone could name. The lime had been doing its work for 20 years. The bones of the kings of France had decayed and crumbled and shifted until they were a mass of fragments, a heap of material in 2 pits that could not be sorted or separated or identified by any method available to the men standing there looking at it. Henry IV was in those pits. The Sun King was in those pits. Louis XV, who had been buried there within living memory, was in those pits. They were all there, together, and no one could tell where one king ended and another began. They gathered everything they could recover, all of it together, the whole mingled heap, and they carried it back into the basilica and placed it in a stone ossuary in the crypt. They put up marble plaques listing the names: Henry IV, Louis XIV, Louis XV, a long roll of the kings and queens of France, their names cut into stone, and behind the stone a pile of fragments that belonged to all of them and to none of them in particular. Sit with that image. The founder of the dynasty and the greatest king in French history, and a dozen others, lying together in the same anonymous dark, stripped not just of their crowns, but of their individual identities, reduced to fragments that no living person could ever again tell apart. Louis XVIII had given his ancestors back their church. He had given them their plaques. He could not give them back their names. This was the restoration. A list of names in front of a pile of bones that no longer knew which king was which. The Bourbons could recover the form of the old monarchy, the church, the titles, the ceremonies, the gestures, the soul of it. the actual continuous living identity of a dynasty that had ruled France for 2 centuries, had dissolved in the lime years before, and was not coming back. Louis XVIII understood this better than he let on, and he governed accordingly, cautiously, within limits, for 10 years. He died in 1824, in his bed, on his throne, the first Bourbon in a long time to manage that particular combination. By the standards of what the family had been through, it counted as a kind of success. His brother inherited the crown and destroyed in 6 years what Louis had spent 10 years carefully preserving. The Count of Artois became Charles X, and Charles X governed like a man who had been waiting his entire life to show France what a real king looked like. The cautious compromises of his brother struck him as weakness, and he intended to replace them with clarity. He had himself crowned at Reims in 1825, in the most elaborate medieval ceremony that could be arranged. The full ancient ritual of the sacred kings, holy oil and ancient forms. A coronation designed to say to France that the king ruled by divine right and had always ruled by divine right and always would. He pushed laws that favored the church and the nobility. He treated the charter as an inconvenience rather than a foundation. He moved, step by step, back toward the absolute monarchy that his great-great-great-grandfather had built, as if the revolution were a dream that France was finally waking from. France was not waking from it. In the summer of 1830, Charles pushed too far. He issued a set of royal ordinances that dissolved the newly elected Chamber of Deputies before it had even convened, restricted the freedom of the press to a degree that amounted to near total censorship, and narrowed the voting rolls so severely that most of the men who had voted in the recent election lost the right to vote in the next one. It was a bid for absolute power, dressed in the language of legal authority, and France recognized it for what it was. Paris rose in 3 days. Street by street, the city threw up barricades. Workers and students and middle-class men who had served in Napoleon's armies and remembered what France had been capable of stood behind those barricades and fought the royal troops. And the royal troops could not hold the city. The army that was supposed to defend Charles X could not or would not do it. And within days, the king's authority had collapsed in the capital. Charles tried, at the end, to save the dynasty by saving the throne for someone else. He abdicated in favor of his young grandson, a child, hoping that an innocent face might succeed where he had failed, that France might accept a Bourbon child if it would not accept a Bourbon reactionary. The politicians of Paris were not interested. They had a different Bourbon in mind, a cousin from the Orleans branch who had agreed to rule as a genuinely constitutional monarch. And it was this man, Louis Philippe, who took the throne, while the last king of the senior Bourbon line gathered his family and left France forever. Charles X died in exile in 1836, in a castle in what is now Slovenia, the final king of the direct Bourbon line that ran from Henry IV through the Sun King to the guillotine and back. He had returned to find a France that was not his, had tried to make it his by force of royal will, and had discovered what his ancestors had discovered before him, in ways that should have taught the lesson clearly enough. France could not be ruled from behind palace walls by a king who had stopped looking out the windows. After 1830, the senior Bourbon line was finished in France. Not weakened, not reduced. Finished. The throne that Henry IV had earned by compromise and patience, and the willingness to become what France needed, would never again be held by a direct descendant of Louis XIV. The blood did not end, but it left. It had already been leaving. For 130 years. Across the mountains, to the south, to a throne in a different country, where the junior branch that everyone had half forgotten was still standing, and that branch had learned something, slowly and painfully and across its own catastrophes, that the senior line in France had never quite managed to learn. When the moment came, it looked out the window. Saint-Denis, the present day. Walk into the basilica north of Paris on any ordinary morning, and you will find tourists moving through with guidebooks. Light coming down through windows that have stood for centuries. A quiet that feels older than the building holding it. Then follow the signs down the stone steps into the crypt, and the quiet changes character. It becomes the specific silence of a place where the dead have been accumulating for a very long time. The crypt at Saint-Denis holds the tombs of the kings and queens of France, or most of them. The marble figures lie on their stone slabs, hands folded, faces composed, wearing the carved expressions of people who have made peace with something large. You can walk past them and read the names. The medieval kings, the Renaissance kings, the Bourbon kings, the ones who built Versailles and lost it and came back and lost it again. They are all here, or the idea of them is here, which in a place like this amounts to the same thing. And then, in the crypt, there is a door that leads to a smaller space, and behind that door is the ossuary. The workers who came here on Louis XVIII's orders in 1817 found bones in 2 lime pits in the churchyard. They gathered what they could and brought it inside and placed it here, behind the marble plaques on the wall, behind the long list of names carved into stone. Henry IV, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and the others, is a single chamber holding the mingled remains of the kings of France. The lime had done its work over 20 years. The bones had crumbled and shifted and blended until no one could separate them. The founder of the Bourbon Dynasty and the greatest king in French history and a dozen others lie in the same anonymous dark fragments of people who once had names that made Europe afraid, now indistinguishable from one another, beyond the reach of anyone who might want to tell them apart. A list of names on a wall. Behind it, bones that no longer know which king is which. This is where the rage of 1793 finally came to rest. Not in triumph, not in erasure. In a quiet room where the kings France tried to dissolve lie together in the dark, neither fully destroyed, nor ever again themselves. Now go to the other room, the one that still stands, exactly as it was built, 12 miles away. In the palace the Sun King made, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is open to visitors every day. You can walk its full length, past the 17 windows, looking over the gardens, past the 17 arches of mirrors on the opposite wall that throw the light back across the gallery in the way Louis XIV designed them to. Millions of people walk through it every year. It remains one of the most beautiful rooms ever constructed. A space that does exactly what it was built to do, fills the person standing in it with the overwhelming sense that the world it belongs to is grander than the world they came from. But history was not finished with that room, and what it chose to do there is almost too precise to believe. On the 18th of January, 1871, the German states that Bismarck had spent a decade pulling together proclaimed their new empire. They chose the Hall of Mirrors as the place to do it, in the room that Louis XIV had built to display the supremacy of the French crown above all other powers in Europe, in the gallery lined with mirrors that had been designed to reflect the glory of France back to France. The Germans stood and declared Germany the new supreme power and their king its emperor. France lost the war that produced that ceremony, and lost the province of Alsace-Lorraine with it, and was made to watch the announcement of its own defeat, and the announcement of its successor's triumph in the most sacred room of the most sacred palace of the French monarchy. The mirrors that had reflected Louis XIV reflected that then, in June of 1919, the Allied powers chose the same room to sign the treaty, ending the war with Germany. The French had selected Versailles deliberately, and the Hall of Mirrors specifically, to answer 1871. In the place where 1871 had happened, the humiliation was answered in the room where it had been inflicted. The mirrors reflected that too. The room Louis built to show France to itself has spent the last 150 years reflecting everyone except the kings who made it. The family that built the most magnificent palace in the world to secure their own power is not in the reflection anymore. They have not been in it for 200 years. And yet, go back further south than Versailles, further than Paris, further than France, cross the mountains that a Sun King once boasted no longer existed, follow the road into Spain, to the palace in Madrid, to the throne that Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV, sat down on in 1700, and that his line has held, with interruptions and exiles and restorations of its own, through every catastrophe of the intervening centuries. Today, in the 21st century, there is a king on the throne of Spain. His name is Felipe VI. He is a direct descendant of that grandson Louis, sent over the mountains 300 years ago. The junior branch, the lesser line, the consolation prize that nobody in 1700 was looking at with envy. He carries the same blood as Henry IV, standing outside the walls of Paris with no way in, the same blood as the Sun King in his Hall of Mirrors, the same blood as Louis XVI, taken to the scaffold in a closed carriage on a January morning, the same blood that France poured lime over in the churchyard at Saint Denis. France tried to erase the Bourbons. France killed the king and the queen and the prince in the Tower. France dug up the dead and poured lime over them and mixed their bones into anonymity. France drove the survivors into exile and closed the door behind them. Twice, until they stayed gone, France did everything a nation can do to remove a family from its soil and its memory and its future. It did not work. The blood France tried to destroy is on a throne in Europe right now. The thing France could not kill was not the crown. The crown is gone, buried in the ossuary with the bones. The thing France could not kill was not the palace. The palace belongs to tourists now, to the millions who walk through the Hall of Mirrors every year without any particular connection to the family that built it. The thing France could not kill was not even the name. The name belongs to history, to textbooks, to the marble plaques on the wall of the crypt. The thing France could not kill was simply the blood, the stubbornness of a family that kept existing even when everything else that defined them was gone. And in the end, that survival came down to a single difference between the two branches of one family. The Bourbons of France built a Hall of Mirrors and walked into it and stayed. They surrounded themselves with their own reflection until the reflection was all they could see. They made a world that showed the king his own glory from every angle and in every surface. And they lived in that world for 100 years. And the longer they lived in it, the less they could see of the country that existed outside the windows. They mistook the reflection for the kingdom. They confused what Versailles showed them with what France actually was. And France, the real France, the one that paid the taxes and bought the bread and read the pamphlets and marched to Versailles in the rain, ran out of patience and came through the glass to get them. The Bourbons of Spain survived because, at the moment that counted, They chose differently. They stopped looking at the mirror. They looked out the window, at the country as it actually existed, changing and demanding and refusing to stay still. And they bent to it, rather than demanding it bend to them. The branch that insisted the country must reflect the king lies in an anonymous heap of bone beneath a quiet crypt. The branch that learned to reflect the country still wears a crown. The kings of France built the most magnificent monarchy the world had ever seen, and they ruled it from inside a room that showed them nothing but themselves. And by the time the mirror shattered, France was already gone.